The town of Blackthorn Hollow was the kind of place where secrets lingered in the shadows and the air carried whispers of stories long forgotten. Nestled at the base of fog-shrouded mountains and surrounded by ancient forests, it was a town seemingly untouched by time. The streets were lined with brick buildings and gas lamps that cast flickering light in the evenings, creating a sense of eerie nostalgia. It was the perfect place for someone looking to start over, and for someone desperate to be left alone. Vivian Sinclair embodied the latter. Her mansion loomed over the town from its perch on Blackthorn Hill, an imposing structure of weathered stone and towering spires that seemed to pierce the gray sky. The house was a source of endless speculation. Its cracked windows and overgrown grounds mirrored the rumors that swirled around its owner, a woman as enigmatic as she was beautiful. The townspeople avoided her at all costs. Children told ghost stories about seeing strange lights in her windows. Adults spoke in hushed tones of her icy gaze and the air of danger that seemed to follow her. It was said that Vivian had inherited a legacy of darkness. Some whispered of witchcraft, others of curses. Whatever the truth, few dared to approach her. Claire Bennett, on the other hand, was the kind of woman who ran headfirst into the unknown. She arrived in Blackthorn Hollow on a crisp autumn afternoon, her small car packed with her belongings and her hopes for a fresh start. The trees lining the road blazed with shades of red and gold, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. After the chaos of her life in Chicago, the quiet beauty of the town felt like a balm. Claire had spent months trying to piece herself back together after her breakup with Melanie, a relationship that had ended in heartbreak and betrayal. She needed distance, a place to heal and redefine herself. Blackthorn Hollow, with its slower pace and charm, seemed like the perfect escape. Her new job as a high school English teacher gave her purpose, and the quaintness of the town appealed to her love of stories and history. But what intrigued her most were the whispers she overheard about Vivian Sinclair. Claire had always been drawn to the mysterious, the misunderstood. When the other teachers at her school warned her to steer clear of the mansion on Blackthorn Hill, she found herself growing more curious. "She's dangerous," one of them had said, lowering their voice as if the walls had ears. "You do well to keep your distance." Claire had smiled politely but dismissed the warnings. People fear what they don't understand, she thought to herself. And Claire had never been one to shy away from the unknown. Her first encounter with Vivian was unplanned. It happened on a rainy Saturday at the town's only bookstore, a cozy, cluttered space filled with the comforting smell of old paper and polished wood. Claire had been browsing the shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines of well-worn novels, when she felt it, the distinct sensation of being watched. She turned and there she was. Vivian Sinclair stood in the narrow aisle, her dark coat dripping with rainwater, her presence commanding despite her stillness. Her pale skin was framed by raven-black hair that fell in loose waves, and her piercing gray eyes locked onto Claire's with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment Claire forgot how to breathe. The rumors hadn't done her justice. Vivian's beauty was striking, but it was her presence, cold and magnetic, that rooted Claire to the spot. She had the air of someone who could destroy you with a word but chose not to, a silent warning woven into every movement. "Excuse me," Vivian said, her voice low and smooth as she reached for a book on the shelf beside Claire. Their fingers brushed briefly, and the air seemed to crackle with an unspoken energy. Claire's heart raced, though she couldn't explain why. "Sorry," Claire murmured, stepping back to give Vivian space. Vivian paused, her gaze lingering on Claire for a beat too long. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared deeper into the bookstore. Claire remained frozen, her mind racing. It wasn't fear she felt, it was curiosity, a magnetic pull she couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, Claire found herself thinking about Vivian more than she cared to admit. The encounter at the bookstore had left a mark, a sense of unfinished business. The stories about Vivian, the warnings, the rumors, they all seemed like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. It didn't help that Claire's new home offered her a perfect view of the mansion on Blackthorn Hill. At night, she would sit by her window and watch the faint flicker of lights in the windows, wondering what secrets lay within those walls. The townspeople's fear only fueled her intrigue. Vivian Sinclair wasn't a monster. Claire was certain of that. But there was something there, something just beneath the surface, and Claire couldn't ignore the pull to find out what it was. What Claire didn't realize as the first hints of winter settled over Blackthorn Hollow was that some secrets weren't meant to be unearthed, and that crossing the threshold of Vivian Sinclair's world might change her forever. The bell above the bookstore door chimed softly as Claire stepped inside, shaking the rain from her umbrella. The warm scent of paper and wood polish embraced her immediately, a welcome contrast to the chill outside. Shelves loomed high, filled with books that whispered of secrets waiting to be discovered. It was one of her favorite places in Blackthorn Hollow, quiet, unassuming, and untouched by the eerie rumors that swirled through the town. Today, though, the stillness felt different. Claire wandered deeper into the store, her fingers trailing absently over the spines of well-worn novels. She scanned the titles, looking for something to lose herself in when she felt it, a strange awareness prickling at the back of her neck. Someone was watching her. She turned slowly, and that's when she saw her. Vivian Sinclair stood a few feet away, partially obscured by the edge of a tall bookshelf. Her presence was impossible to ignore. She wore a long black coat that clung to her figure, its damp hem brushing against her boots. Dark hair, slightly disheveled from the rain, framed a face so striking that it almost didn't seem real. Her eyes, silver gray and piercing, locked onto Claire with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Time seemed to slow. Vivian didn't move, didn't speak. The silence between them was heavy, charged with something Claire couldn't quite name. She should have felt unsettled, intimidated even. This was the woman the entire town whispered about in fearful tones. But the chill that ran down her spine wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something that thrummed low in her chest and made her feel as though the ground beneath her had shifted. Claire forced herself to look away, breaking the connection. She turned back to the shelf, her hands trembling slightly as she pretended to study the books in front of her. Get it together, Claire, she thought, swallowing hard. But she couldn't ignore the way her heart raced or the heat that crept up her neck. Excuse me, a low velvety voice said from behind her. Claire froze. She turned her head slowly, finding herself face to face with Vivian. Up close, her presence was even more overwhelming. Her pale skin seemed to almost glow in the dim light, and her eyes held an unsettling mixture of curiosity and detachment. Sorry, Claire said quickly, stepping back to give her space. Her voice sounded too loud, too eager, and she cringed inwardly. Vivian's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. No need to apologize, she said, her tone calm but carrying an edge that sent another shiver through Claire. Vivian's gaze dropped to the book Claire had been reaching for, an old leather-bound volume with gilded edges. At the same moment they both reached out, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact was fleeting but electrifying. Claire's breath caught, her hand instinctively pulling back as though she had been burned. But it wasn't pain that shot through her. It was something sharper, more profound. A pulse of awareness that settled low in her chest, leaving her unsteady. Vivian seemed unfazed, though her eyes lingered on Claire's for a beat too long. An excellent choice, she said, her voice as smooth as silk. Claire blinked, her mind scrambling to catch up. Oh. Thanks, she stammered, feeling embarrassingly out of sorts. I've heard good things about it. Vivian tilted her head slightly, studying her. Have you? She asked, her tone carrying a hint of amusement. There was something unnerving about the way Vivian looked at her, as though she could see beyond the surface, peeling back the layers of Claire's carefully constructed facade. It was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. Claire cleared her throat, desperate to regain some semblance of composure. Do you come here often? She asked, immediately regretting how cliched it sounded. Vivian raised an eyebrow, her faint smile returning. From time to time, she said. Her answer was vague, but Claire wasn't surprised. Vivian seemed like the kind of person who gave away as little as possible, leaving others to fill in the gaps. And yet there was something undeniably magnetic about her, something that made Claire want to fill those gaps herself. Well, Claire said, clutching the book tightly to her chest, I should probably. She gestured vaguely toward the counter, suddenly feeling out of her depth. Vivian nodded once, stepping aside to let her pass. Have a good day, Miss Bennet, she said, her voice cool but polite. Claire froze mid-step, her pulse quickening. She hadn't introduced herself. She turned back, her brows furrowed. How did you? But Vivian was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the store like she had never been there at all. Claire left the bookstore in a daze, the book still clutched tightly in her hands. The rain had stopped, but the chill in the air remained, settling into her bones. Her mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. Vivian Sinclair was everything the townspeople said she was: intimidating, mysterious, and utterly impossible to ignore. But the fear that gripped others didn't take hold of Claire. If anything, she felt drawn to Vivian, pulled by a force she couldn't explain. As she made her way home, the memory of Vivian's piercing gaze and the brief electric touch of her hand lingered in her mind. She told herself it was nothing, a moment of curiosity and accidental connection. But deep down she knew better. This was the beginning of something. Something she didn't understand but couldn't bring herself to walk away from. The storm rolled in just before noon, casting the town of Blackthorn Hollow into an eerie twilight. Rain lashed against windows, the wind howling through the narrow streets and bending tree branches low. Most of the town huddled indoors, the usual bustle replaced by the sound of rain-soaked silence. Claire pushed open the heavy wooden door of the cafe, her umbrella flipping inside out in the wind as she fought to close it. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her coat dripping water onto the tile floor as the door slammed shut behind her. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a bored-looking barista behind the counter and one other figure seated in the far corner. Vivian Sinclair. Claire's heart skipped a beat as her eyes landed on her. Vivian was sitting alone at a small table by the window, a cup of tea steaming in front of her. The dim light from the overcast sky cast shadows across her sharp features, highlighting the elegance of her pale skin and the deep contrast of her black coat. She was reading a book, her long fingers delicately turning the pages, her expression unreadable. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background as Claire stood frozen in the doorway, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected to see Vivian again so soon, or at all if she was honest. But here she was, as magnetic and untouchable as ever. For a moment Claire considered leaving, slipping out before Vivian noticed her. But the memory of their first encounter lingered, the brush of their hands, the way Vivian had said her name without needing to be told. Curiosity and something deeper, a pull she couldn't name, drove Claire forward. She approached the counter, ordering a latte with a shaky voice before turning to face the cafe. Her heart pounded as she crossed the room, every step deliberate, until she stood before Vivian's table. "Mind if I join you?" Claire asked, her voice steady despite the nervous energy buzzing through her. Vivian looked up slowly, her silver-gray eyes locking onto Claire's with the same unsettling intensity as before. For a moment she said nothing, her gaze flickering over Claire as though weighing her presence. Finally she gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I suppose," Vivian said, her voice low and calm, though there was a hint of reluctance in her tone. Claire smiled, taking the invitation as a victory. She set her cup down and slipped into the chair, feeling the weight of Vivian's gaze settle over her like a cloak. "You have a talent for appearing in unexpected places," Vivian remarked, closing her book with a quiet thud. Claire laughed lightly, though her pulse quickened at the subtle accusation in Vivian's words. "Blackthorn Hollow isn't exactly a bustling metropolis," she said. "Running into people is bound to happen." Vivian tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint, enigmatic smile. "I suppose that's true." The conversation started slowly, like coaxing warmth from a reluctant flame. Vivian's answers were brief, guarded, but Claire pressed on, determined to unravel the mystery that seemed to shroud her. "Do you always read during storms?" Claire asked, nodding toward the closed book. Vivian's eyes flicked to the book, then back to Claire. "It's a habit," she said. "The sound of rain is calming." "Not many people would call a storm calming," Claire said, leaning forward slightly. Vivian's gaze softened, her voice taking on a contemplative edge. "Perhaps not. But I've always found comfort in things others consider unsettling." Claire's breath hitched at the layered meaning in her words, but she didn't falter. "I think that makes sense," she said, her voice quiet. "Sometimes the things that scare us the most are the ones that make us feel alive." Vivian's eyes lingered on her, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. "You have an interesting way of looking at the world," she said finally, her tone laced with curiosity. Claire smiled, emboldened by the faint crack in Vivian's guarded demeanor. "It's what makes life interesting," she said. "You never know what you'll find if you look closely enough." As the conversation continued, the tension began to ease, replaced by a tentative rhythm. Vivian's sharp wit and dry humor emerged, catching Claire off guard and drawing out genuine laughter. In return, Claire shared bits of her life. Her move to Blackthorn Hollow, her love of literature, her fascination with the town's history. Through it all, Vivian remained enigmatic, revealing little about herself but offering just enough to keep Claire intrigued. At one point, Claire leaned forward, her voice lowering conspiratorially. "So what's your take on the rumors?" she asked, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "The townspeople seem convinced you're some kind of dark sorceress." Vivian arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a sardonic smile. "And what do you think, Miss Bennet?" Claire's breath caught at the way her name sounded on Vivian's lips. She shrugged, her smile playful. "I think people are afraid of what they don't understand. But fear isn't always rational." Vivian studied her for a long moment, her smile fading into something more contemplative. "No, it isn't," she said softly, almost to herself. By the time the storm began to ease, the cafe had grown even quieter, the other patrons having slipped away into the rain. Claire and Vivian remained, their conversation flowing more easily now, though the tension never fully disappeared. As Claire sipped the last of her latte, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this connection, was the beginning of something profound. There was a weight to Vivian's presence, a gravity that pulled at her, and though Claire didn't fully understand it, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. When they finally rose to leave, Vivian paused by the door, her gaze lingering on Claire with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Be careful, Claire," Vivian said, her voice low and almost warning. Claire frowned, searching Vivian's expression for meaning, but the woman's face was unreadable. "I'm not afraid of you," Claire said quietly, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. Vivian's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Perhaps you should be." And with that she stepped out into the rain, leaving Claire standing in the doorway, her heart racing and her mind spinning with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. The bond between Claire and Vivian deepened with every interaction, but it was far from ordinary. There was an unspoken rhythm to their relationship, a delicate push and pull that Claire couldn't quite define. Vivian remained as enigmatic as ever, each moment of connection shadowed by her guarded demeanor. Yet Claire found herself drawn to her, captivated by her sharp intellect, razor-edged humor, and the quiet vulnerability that occasionally slipped through the cracks. They had settled into an odd kind of friendship. Vivian never sought Claire out, but she never turned her away either. It was Claire who pushed, who initiated, and she found that once she did, Vivian responded with a subtle warmth that made the effort feel worthwhile. There were evenings spent discussing philosophy and literature, afternoons where they wandered the woods near Vivian's mansion, their conversation flowing in between comfortable silences. Yet for every step closer Claire felt, Vivian seemed to maintain an invisible line, one Claire was never allowed to cross. It was maddening but also thrilling. One evening, over dinner at Vivian's mansion, Claire decided to press her luck. The dining room was both grand and foreboding, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling giving the space a timeless, almost otherworldly quality. A fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting flickering light over the long table where they sat. Vivian had prepared a simple but elegant meal, and they shared a bottle of red wine that left Claire feeling warm and bold. "Can I ask you something?" Claire ventured, setting her glass down. Vivian looked up from her plate, one brow arching slightly. "You can ask," she said, her tone wry. Claire smiled, leaning forward. "What's the deal with the rumors? You know, the whole dark sorceress of Blackthorn Hollow thing. Are you secretly brewing potions in your basement or something?" Vivian's lips curved into a faint smile, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow sip of her wine, her silver-gray eyes watching Claire over the rim of her glass. "You have a vivid imagination, Claire," Vivian said finally, her voice smooth and measured. "Come on," Claire pressed, emboldened by the wine and her curiosity. "The whole town's convinced you're up to something sinister. Doesn't that bother you?" Vivian's smile widened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "People fear what they don't understand," she said. "It's easier to create monsters than to confront their own ignorance." Her answer was evasive, but there was something in her tone, something almost bitter, that made Claire pause. "So you're saying it's all nonsense?" Claire asked, tilting her head. Vivian leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the stem of her wineglass. "I'm saying," she said slowly, "that some things are better left to speculation." The conversation shifted after that, Vivian deftly steering them back to safer topics. But the tension lingered, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something Vivian wasn't ready to share. As the evening wore on, the storm outside intensified. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. When it came time for Claire to leave, Vivian insisted on walking her to the door. "Thanks for dinner," Claire said, pulling on her coat. "You're a surprisingly good cook for someone who lives like a recluse." Vivian smirked, her eyes glinting with amusement. "And you're surprisingly brave for someone who can't take a hint." Claire laughed, though her cheeks flushed at the comment. "Good night, Vivian." "Good night, Claire," Vivian said, her voice soft. As Claire stepped out into the rain, the chill of the night air hit her immediately. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, making her way down the long winding driveway toward her car. The mansion loomed behind her, its dark silhouette stark against the stormy sky. Halfway to her car she felt it. The sensation was subtle at first, a prickle of awareness at the back of her neck. She slowed her steps, glancing over her shoulder. The mansion's windows stared back at her, dark and uninviting, except for one. In the second-story window, a faint light flickered, and for a brief moment, Claire thought she saw a figure standing there, watching her. Her heart leapt into her throat and she stopped in her tracks. The figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the rain and the shadows. "It's nothing," she told herself, shaking her head as she hurried to her car. But the feeling of being watched stayed with her, an unsettling weight that refused to lift. The strange occurrences didn't stop there. The next evening, as Claire sat grading papers in her small, cozy house, the lights began to flicker. At first she dismissed it as a power surge, common enough in a town as old as Blackthorn Hollow. But then the flickering became rhythmic, almost deliberate, and a faint tapping sound echoed from the far corner of the room. Claire froze, her pen hovering over the page. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The tapping stopped, leaving the room eerily silent. Claire's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to laugh. "You're imagining things," she muttered, shaking her head. But later that night as she lay in bed, the feeling returned, that prickle of awareness, the sense that she wasn't alone. She opened her eyes, her breath catching as she thought she saw a shadow move across the room. When she turned on the light, there was nothing there. The townspeople weren't shy about sharing their opinions when they noticed Claire spending more time with Vivian. "You'd do well to keep your distance," Mrs. Abernathy, the owner of the general store, warned her one afternoon. "That woman's trouble. Always has been." "She's just private," Claire argued, though the edge in her voice betrayed her unease. Mrs. Abernathy shook her head, her expression grim. "You don't know what you're getting into, child. Mark my words. Nothing good comes from getting close to Vivian Sinclair." Despite the warnings, Claire couldn't stay away. The pull toward Vivian was undeniable, even as the strange occurrences in her home grew more frequent. Lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own, the faint sound of whispers in the dead of night. Claire couldn't explain any of it. But she refused to believe it was more than coincidence. Still, as she stared up at the distant silhouette of the mansion on Blackthorn Hill, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, whatever it was far darker than she had anticipated. The wind howled through the trees outside, a steady rhythm that matched the tension in the room. Claire sat across from Vivian in the dimly lit study of the mansion. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls lined with bookshelves that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. It was a place that felt like it belonged to another time, filled with the weight of unspoken stories. Vivian was seated in the high-backed armchair near the fire, her posture rigid, one hand gripping the armrest as though she were holding herself in place. She stared into the flames, her silver-gray eyes reflecting the flickering light, her expression unreadable. Claire leaned forward in her chair, her fingers loosely clasped in her lap, her heart pounding as she tried to find the right words. "Vivian," Claire said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for far too long. "Talk to me." Vivian's gaze didn't waver from the fire. For a moment Claire thought she wouldn't answer. Then with a heavy sigh, Vivian finally turned her head to meet Claire's eyes. "What do you want me to say?" Vivian asked, her voice low, almost bitter. "That I'm just as broken as everyone claims? That I'm better off alone for everyone's sake?" Claire flinched at the sharpness of her tone but didn't look away. "I don't believe that," she said firmly. "And I don't think you do either." Vivian let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. You're wrong, she said, her voice tinged with something Claire couldn't quite place. Anger maybe, or sorrow. I am a problem, Claire. A complication. Something people avoid for a reason. That's not true, Claire said, her voice soft but insistent. You're more than what people say about you. Vivian's grip on the armrest tightened, her knuckles turning white. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking slightly. You don't know what it's like to live with this. With everything. Then help me understand, Claire said, leaning forward, her eyes searching Vivian's face. Because all I see right now is someone who's hurting, someone who's pushing everyone away because she thinks she has to. But you don't. You don't have to do this alone. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tightening as she turned her gaze back to the fire. You think it's that simple? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. You think all it takes is someone to say they care and suddenly it's better? No, Claire admitted, her voice trembling. I don't think it's simple at all. But I think it's worth trying. Vivian was silent for a long time, her expression unreadable as she stared into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. I've never been good at letting people in, she said, her words slow and deliberate. It always ends the same way. They leave. Or worse, they stay and regret it. Claire's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her voice. She resisted the urge to reach out, knowing that pushing too hard would only make Vivian retreat further. Instead, she spoke carefully, her tone gentle. Maybe the problem isn't with you, Claire said. Maybe it's with the people who didn't see what you needed. Vivian's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a bitter smile. And you think you're different? She asked, her gaze finally lifting to meet Claire's. You think you won't run when things get too complicated? Claire held her gaze, her breath catching at the storm of emotions swirling in Vivian's eyes. I don't know what's going to happen, she said honestly. But I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you tell me to. Vivian's expression softened, and for the first time that night she looked tired. Not just physically, but in a way that spoke of years of carrying something heavy, something she had never been able to share. I'm not used to this, Vivian admitted, her voice barely audible. Letting someone care. Trusting them to stay. Claire's chest tightened at the admission, and she found herself leaning forward again, her hands resting on her knees. You don't have to have it all figured out, she said gently. I'm not asking for that. I'm just asking for a chance. Vivian's eyes searched hers, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire world had narrowed to the space between them. The tension in the room shifted, softening as if the walls Vivian had built were beginning to crack. I'm not sure I know how, Vivian said, her voice trembling. Claire's lips curved into a small, reassuring smile. That's okay, she said. We can figure it out together. Vivian let out a shaky breath, her hand relaxing its grip on the armrest. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes closing briefly as though the weight of the conversation had left her drained. When she opened them again, there was a faint glimmer of something new. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. Don't make promises you can't keep, Vivian said, her voice softer now, almost teasing. Claire smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. I'm not. I promise. For the first time that night, Vivian's lips curved into a genuine, if hesitant, smile. And in that moment Claire saw her. Not the rumors, not the shadows of her past, but the woman behind it all. A woman who was lonely, yes, but also fiercely intelligent, deeply complex, and worth every ounce of effort it would take to earn her trust. As the fire crackled softly between them, Claire felt the space that had once been filled with tension shift into something else entirely. Something fragile but real. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. The knock at Claire's door came late, cutting through the stillness of the night. She frowned, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was just past midnight. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows of her small house. Blackthorn Hollow was not a place where visitors came unannounced at this hour. She hesitated for a moment, her heartbeat quickening. Something about the timing, the intensity of the knock felt off. Gathering her nerves, she made her way to the door and peered through the peephole. Her breath caught. Vivian stood on the porch, her dark coat whipping around her in the wind, her face pale and drawn. Her usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced by something frantic, something raw. Claire opened the door quickly, the cold air rushing in. Vivian, she said, her voice laced with concern. What's going on? Are you okay? Vivian didn't answer immediately. She stepped inside, her movements sharp and restless. The storm outside seemed to follow her, the air in the room charged with the same electric tension Claire had felt during their most intense conversations. Vivian paced a few steps, then turned to face Claire, her silver-gray eyes wide with something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. "Something's happening," Vivian said, her voice low but urgent. I can't explain it." "Not yet." Claire frowned, stepping closer. "What do you mean?" "Vivian, you're scaring me." Vivian let out a frustrated sigh, her hands raking through her hair. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she said. "I shouldn't have come." "Don't do that," Claire said firmly, crossing the room to stand in front of her. "Don't push me away now. You're here for a reason, so just talk to me." Vivian's gaze softened, and for a moment she looked utterly lost. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "If I tell you, if you get involved, you'll regret it." Claire reached out, her hand brushing Vivian's arm. "Let me decide that," she said gently. "I don't care about the rumors or the shadows or whatever it is you're so afraid of. I care about you." Vivian froze at the words, her breathing uneven as her eyes searched Claire's face. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken tension, until finally Vivian spoke. "I don't deserve this," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't deserve you." And then she kissed her. The kiss was sudden, desperate, a collision of fear and longing. Vivian's hands cupped Claire's face, her touch trembling but firm, as though she were clinging to something she knew she would lose. Claire's breath hitched, her heart pounding as she melted into the kiss, her hands finding their way to Vivian's shoulders. It was a kiss full of contradictions, fierce but tender, hesitant but unyielding. Claire could feel the weight of everything Vivian wasn't saying, the unspoken truths and fears pouring into the connection between them. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and for a moment, it felt as though the rest of the world had fallen away. But then came the sound. A sharp thud against the window, followed by the faint sound of someone, moving outside. Claire pulled back, her head whipping toward the sound, her pulse spiking. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice tight. Vivian stiffened, her body going rigid as her eyes darted toward the window. "Don't," she said sharply, grabbing Claire's wrist as she started to move. "Don't look." Claire ignored the warning, her curiosity outweighing her fear. She moved toward the window, her footsteps careful, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The glass was fogged with condensation, but as she wiped it clear with her hand, she froze. There was something out there. A shadow moved just beyond the edge of the porch light, its shape indistinct but undeniably human. It was too quick, too fluid, disappearing into the darkness before Claire could fully process what she was seeing. She turned back to Vivian, her voice trembling. "There was someone out there. I saw." "Enough," Vivian said, her voice sharp and commanding. She stepped forward, her hand gripping Claire's arm with a force that bordered on desperate. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. You need to stay away, from me, from all of this." "No," Claire said, shaking her head. "I'm not going anywhere." Vivian's expression cracked, her composure slipping as frustration and fear battled for dominance. "You don't get it," she said, her voice breaking. "This isn't something you can fix, Claire. This isn't something you can fight. If you stay, you'll get hurt. Or worse." "Then tell me," Claire said, her voice rising. "Stop shutting me out and tell me what's going on. Let me help you." Vivian hesitated, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I can't," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Why not?" Claire demanded. "Because I won't survive if you get caught in this," Vivian said, her voice cracking. "And I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you." The raw vulnerability in her words stole Claire's breath, but she refused to back down. She stepped closer, her hand reaching up to rest against Vivian's cheek. "I'm not afraid of you," Claire said softly. "And I'm not afraid of whatever's out there. But I am afraid of losing you, of watching you fight this alone when you don't have to." Vivian closed her eyes, leaning into Claire's touch for the briefest moment before pulling away. "I don't know how to let you in," she whispered. "Then let me show you how," Claire said. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling as the shadows beyond the window seemed to grow darker, closer. Vivian glanced toward the glass, her jaw tightening as though she could sense something Claire couldn't. "You need to promise me," Vivian said, her voice trembling. "Promise me that if this gets worse you'll leave. That you'll protect yourself." Claire hesitated, her resolve wavering under the weight of Vivian's plea. But she shook her head, her voice steady. "I can't promise that," she said. "I'm with you, Vivian. No matter what." Vivian's eyes closed, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she turned away. The storm outside roared on, but inside, the only sound was the uneven rhythm of their breathing, the unspoken tension between them thick enough to suffocate. Whatever was happening, whatever danger loomed, Claire knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going to let Vivian face it alone. The morning light crept through the curtains of Claire's small house as she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by a growing collection of books, photocopied documents and hastily scrawled notes. The air smelled of stale coffee and her laptop screen glowed dimly, displaying an article from a decades-old local newspaper. Her eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop now. Not when she was finally starting to piece things together. Vivian Sinclair wasn't just the town's outcast. Her family had been central to Blackthorn Hollow's history for centuries. A history steeped in darkness and fear. It had started innocently enough. Claire had gone to the library to look for answers, thinking she might uncover a few minor details about Vivian's past to help make sense of her cryptic warnings. But what she found was far more than she'd anticipated. The name Sinclair appeared again and again, woven into the fabric of the town's history. There were records of land ownership dating back to the early 18th century, stories of immense wealth and influence that seemed to evaporate almost overnight. Accounts of strange occurrences began to surface. Harvests failing, animals disappearing, and illnesses spreading with no apparent cause. The Sinclairs, once revered, had become a family of whispers and suspicion. The rumors turned darker in the mid-1800s with tales of witchcraft and curses. Claire found references to trials, not official like the infamous Salem proceedings but quieter, deadlier. The townspeople of Blackthorn Hollow had taken matters into their own hands, accusing Sinclair women of dark practices and punishing them without the burden of proof. The deaths were brutal, often blamed on justice or divine intervention. Claire's stomach churned as she read a particularly graphic account of Edith Sinclair, dragged from her home and drowned in the river for allegedly summoning a storm that destroyed half the town's crops. The last line of the article lingered in her mind. Whether the accusations were true, the Sinclairs' connection to the unnatural remains an unshakable part of Blackthorn lore. As the hours stretched into days, Claire's research deepened. She began to piece together a timeline of the Sinclair women, from the earliest settlers to the present day. Nearly every generation had suffered tragedy. Unexplained deaths, mysterious disappearances, and lives marked by isolation. Vivian's mother, Eleanor Sinclair, had vanished under strange circumstances nearly 20 years ago, leaving no trace behind. Vivian herself was barely mentioned in public records after that, as though she had been erased along with her mother. But it wasn't just the family's tragic history that unsettled Claire. It was the pattern. Every story, every death, seemed to carry the same whispers of something unnatural, something cursed. The details were vague, often contradictory, but the underlying fear was consistent. One line, scrawled in an old journal Claire found buried in the library archives, sent a chill down her spine. The Sinclairs carry more than blood, they carry darkness. And it follows them wherever they go. By the time Claire closed her laptop that evening, her mind was a storm of questions and doubts. She sat back, rubbing her temples as she stared at the mess of papers scattered across the table. The more she learned, the more her feelings for Vivian grew complicated. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward her, the undeniable attraction, the way Vivian seemed to see straight through her, past her walls and defenses. But now that pull was tangled with something else. Fear. Not of Vivian herself, but of what surrounded her, what clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Claire replayed the strange occurrences in her mind. The flickering lights, the whispers in the night, the figure outside the window. Were they coincidences as she had initially told herself? Or were they something more, something tied to the curse that seemed to haunt the Sinclair name? Her heart ached as she thought of Vivian's words the night she had shown up at her door. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Maybe Vivian was right. Maybe she didn't understand. But how could she walk away now? Not when she was this close to the truth. And not when she felt so deeply for the woman who had become the center of her world. That night, as the wind howled outside her window, Claire couldn't sleep. The shadows in her room seemed to stretch longer than they should, and every creak of the house made her heart race. She pulled her blankets tighter around her, her mind replaying the stories she'd uncovered. She thought of Vivian, her sharp wit, her guarded smiles, the way her voice softened when she let her walls down. And she thought of the weight Vivian carried, the loneliness etched into every line of her face. Claire couldn't imagine what it must have been like to grow up under the shadow of such a legacy, to live with the fear of becoming the monster everyone believed you to be. Despite everything, Claire knew one thing with absolute certainty. She couldn't give up on Vivian. Whatever truth lay hidden in the Sinclair family's past, whatever darkness haunted her, Claire was determined to face it. For Vivian. She just hoped she was strong enough to handle whatever came next. The night was cold and still as Claire made her way up the winding path to Vivian's mansion, the moonlight barely piercing through the heavy fog that clung to the hill. The weight of her decision pressed down on her with every step, but she couldn't turn back now. Not after everything she'd uncovered, not after everything she felt. Vivian deserved the truth. Not the evasions, not the half-answers, but the full, unvarnished truth. Her breath came in shallow bursts as the towering silhouette of the mansion emerged from the mist, its dark windows like unblinking eyes staring down at her. The front door loomed ahead and for a moment Claire hesitated. She thought of the warnings, the whispers, the unease that had followed her since the night she first met Vivian. But then she thought of Vivian herself, her quiet strength, her vulnerability, her fear. Claire raised her hand and knocked. Vivian opened the door with a sharpness that startled Claire, her eyes wide with surprise and something Claire couldn't quite place. Anger? Fear? Relief? She was wrapped in a loose, dark robe, her hair disheveled as though she'd been pacing restlessly. For a moment neither of them spoke, the tension between them thick and crackling. "Claire," Vivian said finally, her voice low and guarded. "What are you doing here?" Claire stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the warmth of the house doing little to ease the chill in her bones. She turned to face Vivian, her heart pounding as she gathered her resolve. "I need answers," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "I can't keep doing this, walking around in the dark while you push me away." Vivian's expression darkened, her hands tightening around the edges of her robe. "This isn't a conversation you want to have," she said, her voice tense. "You should go." "No," Claire said, her tone sharp. "Not this time. You've been running from this, Vivian, from whatever it is you're so afraid of. But I'm here and I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth." Vivian stared at her, the silence stretching into something almost unbearable. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, she stepped back, gesturing for Claire to follow. "Fine," Vivian said, her voice laced with resignation. "But don't say I didn't warn you." They ended up in the study, the fire in the hearth casting long shadows on the walls. Vivian stood near the window, her back to Claire as she stared out into the fog-covered grounds. The tension in her posture was palpable, her hands gripping the windowsill as though she needed the support. "I don't even know where to start," Vivian said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "How about the truth?" Claire said softly, taking a tentative step closer. "Start with that." Vivian turned, her silver-gray eyes meeting Claire's. For a moment she looked like she might refuse. But then something shifted in her expression. An exhaustion, a surrender. "The rumors," Vivian began, her voice steady but heavy, "aren't entirely wrong. The Sinclairs, my family, we've been cursed for generations. It's not just superstition, Claire. It's real." Claire's breath hitched, her heart pounding as she listened. "It started centuries ago," Vivian continued, her gaze distant as though she were seeing the past play out before her. "An ancestor of mine, Isabella Sinclair, made a bargain, a desperate, foolish attempt to protect the family from ruin. But bargains like that always come with a price." "What kind of price?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Vivian hesitated, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "The darkness," she said finally. "It's passed down through the women in my family. A curse that manifests in unnatural ways. It's why so many of us have suffered, why so many have died. The power is dangerous, volatile. And it's inside me." Claire's throat tightened, the weight of Vivian's confession settling over her like a heavy cloak. "Vivian," she said softly, stepping closer. "What does it do?" Vivian shook her head, her voice breaking as she said, "It feeds on emotion, fear, anger, pain. The more I feel, the stronger it gets. And when it takes over, I can't control it. People get hurt, Claire. People die. Claire's chest ached at the anguish in Vivian's voice, the tears glistening in her eyes. She thought of the whispers, the warnings, the fear that surrounded Vivian wherever she went. It all made sense now. The isolation, the distance, the walls Vivian had built around herself. This is why I don't let people get close, Vivian said, her voice trembling. This is why I push you away. Because if I let myself feel too much, if I lose control. She trailed off, turning back to the window as though she couldn't bear to look at Claire. Claire stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. You're not a monster, Vivian. You don't understand, Vivian said, her voice sharp. I've seen what I can do. I felt it. It's not just a part of me, Claire. It is me. No, Claire said firmly, closing the distance between them. She reached out, her hand resting gently on Vivian's arm. It doesn't define you. It doesn't change who you are. Vivian turned to her, her expression crumbling as tears spilled down her cheeks. How can you say that? She asked, her voice breaking. How can you look at me and not see the danger? Because I see you, Claire said, her voice soft but unwavering. I see someone who's been fighting this alone for too long. Someone who's scared and hurting but still trying to protect the people she cares about. You don't have to carry this by yourself, Vivian. Let me help you. Vivian's breath hitched, her walls finally breaking as she leaned into Claire's touch. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. I don't know if I can keep it from hurting you. Claire wrapped her arms around Vivian, holding her close as she whispered, You don't have to do it alone. Whatever this is, we'll face it together. I'm not going anywhere. Vivian clung to her, the tension in her body slowly giving way to something softer, something almost fragile. For the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face the darkness alone. The air inside the mansion was suffocating, thick with an unseen weight that pressed down on Claire's chest. She stood near the center of the study, her eyes locked on Vivian, who paced the room like a caged animal. The fire in the hearth flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows with an intensity that felt almost alive. Vivian's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of a nearby table, her knuckles white with strain. Her breaths came in short, ragged gasps, and the air around her seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. It's happening again, Vivian said, her voice shaking with barely contained fear. I can feel it. Vivian, look at me, Claire said, her voice firm but gentle. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest as the tension in the room mounted. Vivian shook her head, her hair falling across her face as she turned away. You need to leave, she said, her voice breaking. It's not safe. I'm not going anywhere, Claire said, her tone resolute. She closed the distance between them, reaching out to place a hand on Vivian's shoulder. Whatever this is, whatever's happening, we'll face it together. Vivian flinched at her touch, the energy in the room surging as though in response. The chandelier overhead swayed violently, the crystals clinking like distant bells. The floor beneath them shuddered and Claire stumbled, catching herself against the edge of the table. Don't you see? Vivian said, spinning to face her. Her silver-gray eyes were wild, filled with fear and despair. It's already starting. I can't stop it. I've tried, but it's stronger than me. If you stay, it will destroy you. Claire's chest tightened at the raw vulnerability in Vivian's voice, but she refused to back down. She stepped closer, her eyes blazing with determination. Listen to me, Claire said, her voice steady despite the tremors rattling the room. You're stronger than you think. This thing, this darkness, it doesn't own you. You can fight it, but you don't have to do it alone. Let me help you. Vivian's lips parted as though she wanted to argue, but the words never came. Instead, she let out a strangled gasp, her body doubling over as a wave of energy rippled through the room. The fire in the hearth roared, its flames shooting higher, and a low, guttural hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Get out, Vivian pleaded, her voice hoarse as she clutched at her chest. Claire, please. I can't. You can, Claire interrupted, her voice breaking as she grabbed Vivian's arms. I'm not afraid of you, Vivian. I'm afraid of losing you. And I'm not going to let that happen. The ground beneath them trembled violently, cracks spidering across the wooden floor as the energy in the room reached a fever pitch. Objects flew from the shelves, shattering against the walls, and the air grew colder, biting against Claire's skin. Vivian fell to her knees, her hands clutching her head as though trying to block out the chaos. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice broken. "It's coming." Claire knelt in front of her, her hands cupping Vivian's face, forcing her to look up. "Listen to me," Claire said, her voice shaking but resolute. "You're not alone in this. Whatever this thing is, it doesn't get to take you away from me. You're stronger than it. We're stronger than it." Vivian's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment the storm in the room seemed to pause. The energy pulsing through the air dimmed, and the tremors in the floor eased, as though the darkness itself were hesitating. "How?" Vivian whispered, tears streaming down her face. "How can you still believe in me after everything?" Claire's own eyes glistened with tears as she leaned closer, her forehead resting against Vivian's. "Because I see you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not the curse, not the darkness. You. The woman who fights every day to protect the people she loves, even when she's terrified. The woman who's stronger than she knows." Vivian's breath hitched, her hands shaking as they came up to rest on Claire's. The connection between them was electric, grounding, and for the first time, Claire felt the storm inside the mansion begin to recede. But the reprieve was brief. A deafening roar shook the house, and the shadows in the room deepened, coalescing into a swirling vortex at the center of the study. The energy was palpable, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Vivian tensed, her body trembling as though the darkness were pulling at her, trying to claim her. "I can't hold it back," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "It's too strong." "Yes, you can," Claire said fiercely, her grip on Vivian tightening. "You're stronger than this. You've been fighting it your whole life and you're still here. You're still you." The vortex surged, the shadows writhing like living things, but Claire didn't falter. She pulled Vivian closer, wrapping her arms around her as if sheer force of will could keep the darkness at bay. "I'm here," Claire whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I'm not leaving you, Vivian. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Vivian clung to her, her body trembling as she buried her face in Claire's shoulder. The energy in the room pulsed violently, but Claire felt something shift. Something inside Vivian. The trembling in her body began to subside, replaced by a quiet strength that Claire hadn't seen before. The shadows seemed to hesitate, their movements slowing as though they too could feel the change. The roar of the vortex softened, and the room grew still, the oppressive weight in the air lifting as the darkness began to dissipate. When the last of the shadows faded, the room fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Vivian pulled back, her breath coming in uneven gasps as she looked at Claire with wide, disbelieving eyes. "You did it," Claire said softly, a small smile breaking through the tears on her face. "You fought it." Vivian shook her head, her hands trembling as they reached up to cup Claire's face. "No," she said, her voice cracking. "We did." Claire smiled, her heart swelling as she leaned into Vivian's touch. "We'll face it together," she said, her voice full of quiet conviction. And for the first time, Vivian allowed herself to believe it. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of the study, casting a faint golden glow over the room. The remnants of the previous night's chaos lay scattered across the floor, splintered wood, shattered glass, and the faint traces of darkness that had retreated into the shadows. Yet, despite the destruction, a fragile peace hung in the air. Vivian sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, but her silver-gray eyes held a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Across from her, Claire leaned against the edge of the desk, her arms crossed as she watched Vivian with a mix of concern and unwavering resolve. "You're sure it's gone?" Claire asked, her voice soft but steady. Vivian nodded, though her gaze remained distant. "For now," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But it's never really gone. It's dormant." She let out a heavy sigh, her hands trembling slightly as she ran them through her hair. "I've spent my entire life trying to keep it buried, Claire. But last night, it felt different. Like it wasn't just me fighting anymore." Claire stepped closer, her hand resting gently on Vivian's shoulder. "It wasn't just you," she said firmly. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Vivian's eyes flicked up to meet Claire's, and for a moment, the vulnerability there was almost too much to bear. "I don't know how to move forward," Vivian admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long thinking this was all I'd ever be. That the curse was all I'd ever be." Claire crouched down in front of her, taking Vivian's hands in her own. That's not true, she said, her voice filled with quiet intensity. You're more than this curse, Vivian. You're strong, you're kind, and you're capable of so much more than you realize. Last night wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Vivian let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around Claire's. How can you be so sure? Because I know you, Claire said simply. And I know what we can do together. The days that followed were filled with both reflection and rebuilding. Together they began to repair the mansion, cleaning up the debris, sealing the cracks, and letting light into rooms that had been shuttered for years. It was hard work, but it was grounding, a physical manifestation of the changes happening within them both. During those quiet moments, Claire would catch Vivian smiling, small, fleeting, but genuine. She seemed lighter somehow, as though the weight she'd carried for so long had finally shifted. It wasn't gone, but it no longer defined her. One evening, as they sat on the front steps of the mansion, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Vivian broke the comfortable silence between them. I've been thinking, she said, her voice soft but steady. About the curse. About what it means. Claire turned to her, her brows furrowing slightly. What about it? Vivian hesitated, her fingers trailing over the edge of the step. It's always felt like this. Shadow hanging over me. Like no matter what I did, it would always be there waiting to take control. But last night when you were there, she paused, her voice catching. It felt different. It felt like I could actually face it. Claire's chest tightened with emotion, but she managed a small smile. That's because you're not fighting it alone anymore, she said. We'll figure this out, Vivian. Whatever it takes. Vivian turned to her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You make it sound so simple. It's not, Claire admitted. But we're stronger together. And I believe in you. I believe in us. They began to research the curse in earnest, piecing together fragments of history and folklore that Claire had uncovered during her initial search. Vivian shared stories of her family, what little she knew, and what she had pieced together from her own experiences. Together they worked to understand the darkness, not as an unstoppable force, but as something that could be faced, perhaps even tamed. There were setbacks, moments of doubt and fear that threatened to overwhelm them both. But every time Vivian faltered, Claire was there to steady her, to remind her that she wasn't alone. And in turn, Vivian's strength and resilience inspired Claire, showing her that love was worth the risk, no matter how uncertain the path ahead. One night, as they sat by the fire in the study, surrounded by books and notes, Vivian reached out and took Claire's hand. I never thought I'd have this, she said quietly. Someone who doesn't run. Someone who stays. Claire squeezed her hand, her heart swelling with emotion. You don't have to thank me for that, she said. It's where I want to be. With you. Vivian smiled, the warmth in her expression chasing away the lingering shadows. I don't know what the future holds, she admitted. But for the first time I feel like I can face it. Together, Claire said, her voice soft but firm. Together, Vivian agreed. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and fear, began to transform into something new. Light filled its halls, laughter echoed through its rooms, and the shadows that had once seemed so impenetrable began to retreat. It wasn't a perfect ending. The curse still loomed, its presence a constant reminder of the challenges they faced. But it no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle. It felt like something they could overcome. As the seasons changed, so did they. Vivian learned to trust not just Claire, but herself, recognizing that the curse was a part of her story, but not the whole of it. And Claire discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. A love that burned brighter than any fear, a determination to stand by Vivian no matter what. Together they proved that even in the heart of darkness, light could endure. And as they stood side by side facing the unknown, they knew that whatever came next they would face it as one.